Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. People are still coming in, but we'll start. This is a webinar about consumption-based climate targets and what kind of consumption that is compatible with different climate targets. We will talk about policy developments in Sweden. We will talk about several studies which have looked into consumption in line with climate targets, and we are looking forward to a great panel discussion. My name is Göran Finnveden, and I am happy to be program director of the research program called Mr. Sustainable Consumption, which is organizing this webinar. We are happy to say that we are probably Sweden's largest research program on sustainable consumption, and perhaps one of the largest also globally. We're around 20 different institutions, academic institutions, businesses, municipalities, governmental agencies, etc., that are involved in this research program, which is running now in its fifth year, and we will continue for 4 more years. By that, I would like to hand over to the moderator of today's webinar, and that is Robert Höglund, who's an independent climate advisor and also a member of the board of directors of the research program, Mr. Sustainable Consumption. Thanks.
Thank you, Göran, and welcome everyone. It's a very exciting webinar. The proposed target is historic, that all 8 parties actually agree on a target to reduce consumption-based emissions. It's also something I personally worked with for many years. I'll try to lobby for this to happen, so I'm particularly happy to see this being proposed and close to happening. And today we'll explore what that could mean in practice and listen to researchers talking about how sustainable consumption practices could look like, what kind of policies that can imply. And we'll start with a presentation from Emma Nohrén, who was the chair of the Swedish Cross-Party Committee on Environmental Objectives. And then we'll have 4 presentations from researchers on studies on consumption. And both of these sessions will be followed by questions, first to Emma, and then after the 4 studies, there will be additional questions. And then you can use the Q&A function. Don't use the chat for the questions, and direct them directly in the Q&A. This will be followed by a panel discussion where we'll discuss what does this target mean and what could the policy implications be. And there will be some room for questions there as well. I'll present all the speakers one by one rather than take them all now at the start. So with that said, I would like to welcome Emma Nohrén to present the proposed target. What does the Swedish-based consumption target look like?
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for inviting me. I will share screen here and make sure it works as it should. Hopefully. So I hope you can see it now.
Yeah, it works.
Perfect. Well, as Robert said, I am the chair of this cross-party committee on environmental objectives. I belong to the Swedish Green Party. I've been a parliamentarian myself, but as a chair, I should just represent this committee. And there is other people to fill up the different parties. But so I'm just a chair for this one. Yes, for your knowledge. But thank you very much for inviting me. It has been a great honor to be able to do this work and now to present the result. It has been a very, very busy year with intensive work to develop and propose new targets to reduce Sweden's global climate footprint. And I will just state that this is a proposal from the committee to the government. It has not yet been it's just a proposal, but since 8 parties stand behind this work, it has a great chance to be come true and be real. and it will be a great ground for further implementation. So, what is the Cross-Party Committee on Environmental Objectives? Well, it's a committee, as I said, consisted of 8 different parties, the same parties at the Swedish Parliament, and work on different environmental objectives at a time, and they are assigned by the government. And the last year we had worked with this, as you see here, to have a comprehensive strategy for reducing consumption-based emission with the ambition of achieving sustainable consumption in climate terms in a cost-efficient and socially efficient way. And we worked for 1 year. We had a staff, but we have had a lot of experts. Some of them you will hear today, later on in the program, and try to make a common ground and do a work that will last for long for Sweden, and hopefully also can inspire others. So what have we then achieved? Well, let me go back to 2017. Then Sweden became the first country in the world to set a long-term target to reach a net zero emission within Sweden's border. And that was actually thanks to this committee and the work they did 2015 and 2016. It was very ambitious, and at that time it was groundbreaking, but since then many countries have followed, and what was then striking as something spectacular is now considered as common practice. And what we in the committee says that it's important that all countries have to reduce their own territorial emissions in the line with the 1.5-degree target in the Paris Agreement. However, countries are currently not doing enough, and we see that we will, with the things laying on the table today, we will not reach the 1.5-degree target. Therefore, this committee now proposes that Sweden, as the first country in the world, should take a comprehensive approach to Sweden's global climate footprint, in addition to the objectives adopted 2017. And we are doing that by proposing a new intendant in the generation goal, stating that Sweden should have a negative global climate footprint by 2045. In practice, this means that Sweden will take the responsibility and use the national resources we have to help to reduce the global emissions. And we say that this can be done by achieving these 3 goals. Reducing territorial emissions to a net zero by 2045 and achieving the other territorial climate targets that the Parliament decided in 2017. And that remains a priority in the Swedish climate policy. But the committee also proposed 2 new targets, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about now. One is the objective to reduce Sweden's consumption-based emission, which is to reduce the climate footprint of the products and services made by private individuals and also the public sectors, regardless wherever they have occurred and where they are produced. And this includes everything like transport, food, housing, IT, electronics, clothing. We also suggest a target for the climate benefit of export. For example, the climate benefit that arise due to the fact that Sweden's export, on the average, are more climate smart in many sectors than other corresponding products. And here we can talk about climate smart steel, forest product, electricity, and so on. And we say that all these targets have to be reached and achieved separately. They are not connected. They are in the same idea. So let's look into the consumption-based target, what it looks like. Right now, Sweden have the climate impact of consumption is approximately 90 million tons, or 9 tons per person. And to achieve the 1.5 degree target, we need to go down to 1 ton per person. The committee proposed that Sweden's climate impact from the consumption should reach a net zero by 2045. But as you see, it's not going down to the 0 point here. So we also suggest there is some flexibility called international climate benefits that can be used. And that includes negative emissions, verified emissions reductions through investments abroad, and also this climate benefit from export. As you see, it's 2 trajectories here, and we propose a main trajectory, the blue one, that we have to reach, and a green one that is in line with 1.5 degrees that we will strive upon. And the blue one is based on that Sweden and EU reach our territorial climate goals, and all other countries reach their climate pledge they have under the Paris Agreement. And if we look at the export trajectory, there is also a trajectory. And as I said before, this depends on how Swedish products can displace less climate smart products abroad and therefore reduce the global emissions. The climate benefit from export must be greater than the gap between the main target path for the climate impact, the blue line on the last slide, from consumption and zero emission, including the international climate investments and negative emissions. This means that the climate benefit for export must be greater than the gap in 2045. And this trajectory is also based on that Sweden and EU reach our territorial climate goals, and that other countries will adjust in line with the climate promises to the Paris Agreement. And this figure here shows how this will look like now, and what we need to achieve. What we see that we are here in the forefront, that we are lacking statistics and methods, and we have a large amount of proposal for more statistics that are needed, and also different kind of data to make sure that this will work, and also make sure that there is the right numbers behind, and it have to develop over time. This means that we will also that we suppose a control station every 4th year, and this will evaluate the objectives, and if necessary, the government can propose to the parliament to adjust the numbers based on defined criteria, like the climate action taken by other countries, the latest climate science from IPCC and other climate pledge to the Paris agreements, and statistics if there have changed or we have new statistics that we should include. We have also looked in for aviation. And regarding aviation and shipping, we say that the regulation of the climate impact from international aviation and shipping should primarily come from the international organizations. For aviation, it's ICAO, and for shipping, it's IMO, and of course also from EU. However, we see that the objectives and instruments that are provided by ICAO and IMO today are far from sufficient, and we are not in line with the Paris Agreement. The impact of aviation and shipping, the climate impact, must be reduced. And we see that instead it is going up. So therefore, the committee proposed that the emission from bunkering, for example, when it's refueled in Sweden for international flights, should be included in the Swedish long-term territorial climate goal of achieving a net zero emission within the Swedish territory 2045. By this proposal, Sweden, together with the United Kingdom, will be the first country in the world to increase responsibility for having a goal of reducing emissions from international aviation. We also propose that the carbon dioxide emission from domestic flights within Sweden will be included in the milestone target for domestic transportation, domestic transports by 2030. That is already in place. So this is what we look for aviation, and when we look at shipping, we propose that half of the emissions from ships and international voyages that are called or depart from Swedish port will be included in the long-term territorial climate target. And this is in line with EU Fuel Maritime that are supposed by the Commission that is now on the way to be legislation. So we are prior here together with the UK even here. We also have a big package of goals, instruments, and other measures to make sure that the public procurement the public will take its responsibility for the carbon emissions. And in the public procurement, we have a nice framework of different tools. First, the committee proposed a new target that implies that the public sector must transition faster than the society in general. We don't say how fast, but it must be faster than the society in general. So the public sector must drive the transition forward. As said, we also propose a number of constitutional amendments, including statutory obligation to take a national climate targets into account in public procurement and other proposals. And these proposals together indicate a guide for the actors in public procurement to make climate smart choices. So we also have a big set of agreements upon our international and EU standards and what we as in our positions. So, oh, I see here it's in Swedish. I'm sorry for that. But all this to conclude, the committee have made sure that Sweden should take responsibility and use the national proposals to help to reduce the climate emissions in other ways. And we can conclude it in these 6 different ways. And that's Sweden. We propose that Sweden should strengthen its work in all relevant international contexts to reduce the global emissions in line with the 1.5 goal. We propose that Sweden should strengthen its work in EU in the same way to reduce the emission to 1.5. We want to contribute to fight against climate change and increase ambition in other countries, for example, through climate aid, knowledge, and climate policies. We propose this trajectory, how to reduce Sweden's consumption-based emission to a climate sustainable level. We work to increase the climate benefit from export of climate smart products, services, and energy. And we say that the emissions from the public procurement goods and service must reduce faster than the emissions from the social society in general. So here we have the different goals and aims that we are setting up. And I think that when have all 8 parties in the Swedish Parliament standing behind this, it is a robust system that will work in the future, regardless who will be in government. But it's also a stepping stone because now we need to fill it with action so we will actually achieve this. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Great to see this exciting proposal. So please post your questions in the Q&A. We have a 5-minute Q&A here. We've got a couple of questions, but I can start with asking you, what do you think were the key sort of things that made all 8 parties actually agree on this? We could read in the media before that there was some disagreement, but they all came together and have now a very solid proposal that everyone stands behind. What do you think was behind it?
Yep, I think this committee have been up and running since 2010. And one of the success stories behind it is to take a question away from the everyday politics, where you stand up in the chair and you say, I know better than you all the time. But you work together in a safe room where you're allowed to elaborate and think about different things and say it out loud together with experts, and it's a learning process. So you do this together, and then you have the same knowledge, so to speak. And on top of that, of course, then there comes the ideologies. Different parties have different solutions. But when you have this common understanding and common ground, it's easier to make agreements. And it was also a will from all parties, I have to say, to actually do this. It was hard. We had 27 meetings in almost 11.5 months. So we're quite tired of each other in the end. But when we said, no, this will not work, someone raised their hand. But if we do like this, and we tried all the time. And I think that was something. And of course, a great staff in the secretariat that had the knowledge and could come up with all these different facts and things that we would need to take good actions.
No, that's great to hear. Can you just clarify what will happen next? So what's the process, maybe for international listeners as well? How will that move to becoming law?
Now we have handed over to the government, and then it usually goes out on a referral, remissrunda in Swedish, where everyone can read it and say that we think this is good and this is not so good, or you should change it, or why did you think about this? And it was sent out to some NGOs, municipalities and regions and so on. But even if you are not appointed, you can always answer. So it's up to all the organization. And it looked like this, the book. And then the government will hopefully take all these new things into account and try to make a proposal for the parliament. And since we have all the parties behind this, if there are not too many changes, I think it will pass, and then we will be the first country in the world having this.
Great. We also have some questions on flights. You covered that in the presentation, but maybe for just clarify, there's a question if people Swedes fly out of Copenhagen, for example, will that be included, or international flights where you change flights? How does that work?
No, it would be flights that are filling up gas or whatever they are using in Sweden. So an international flight is going from Sweden, so it will not cover the ones in Kastrup or other places, but at least we will have some of the impact that we have. And we know that there are more suggestions now in the Fit for 55 package proposed by the Commission. And if some of them come true, maybe this is not needed anymore, but we don't know what's happening with that. So this is one way of what we can do from the Swedish way or the Swedish side.
Perfect, so that clarifies it. Okay, so a last question here. How will you account for the positive climate impact of exports? And shouldn't the negative impacts of exports be accounted for as well?
This is a quite new research field with the good climate export. So it needs to have more data, and in this we only have numbers from 2010, and try to make a trajectory but we don't have the data for everything yet and how this will work. So we need to work with this a little bit more to make it solid. But what we know now and what the researchers and scientists say, this is what it looked like this day. But this is also why we need to have these control stations.
Yeah, an evolving field. Okay,
and of course, both negative and positive impacts will be within it, of course, and it will be accounted.
Yeah, important clarification there. Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Emma. You will also be in the panel, so if there are more questions, they can be posed to you then as well. Now we'll move on with the presentations from researchers. We'll look at 4 studies of consumption that goes in line with climate targets. And Göran Finnveden is first. You already presented yourself, but you're going to talk about 4 low carbon futures for Sweden in 2050.
Thank you. This is results from research that we actually did in another research program called Beyond GDP Growth, Scenarios for a Sustainable Built Environment. And Beyond GDP Growth here can be seen as that we didn't have GDP growth included necessarily in the scenarios. We didn't assume that there will be GDP growth in the scenarios. Instead, we were focusing on other aspects in the scenarios, and then the GDP growth can be whatever it becomes, more or less. In some of the scenarios, it would probably grow, and others, it would definitely decrease. So the scenarios we were looking at are backcasting scenarios or target fulfilling scenarios for Sweden in 2050. And there were 4 targets, 2 environmental targets and 2 more social targets. And the first environmental target was related to climate. So that will be my focus here in the presentation today, where we set the target of 0.82 tons of CO2 equivalent. And that is related to sort of a target which would lead to a 1.5 degree trajectory for the year 2050. Of course, it needs to be even further reduced after 2050, but we had 2050 as the target year. And that would be consumption-based. And then we had a land use target, also consumption-based. And for the social targets, we had a target that all residents should be entitled to participation and influence in political choices and decisions making that affect their lives. And the 4th target was that residents in Sweden should have sufficient access to resources and services that can create opportunities for housing, education, social care, and social security, as well as favorable conditions for good health. This phrasing was partly taken from the Swedish constitution, what the society should provide for its citizens. I will not go into detail in the scenarios. They are presented in publications. We had 4 backcasting scenarios then. I'll just mention them briefly. One which we call collaborative economy, where much of the governance lies in the hands of the citizens, lots of sharing of resources, and prosumer networks. Another scenario we called circular economy and the welfare state, which is of these 4 closest to the sort of business as usual scenario, where the government rules supported by the industry, but of course lots of aspects from circular economy included, like reuse, repair, etc. Automation for quality of life, very different scenario where robots produce while citizens enjoy leisure time, so much reduced working time in this scenario. And then yet another very different scenario, local self-sufficiency, where household production in locally governed communities is the basis for this scenario. And all of them were built. We didn't assume that they would be reliant on future economic growth. Instead, that could change in the different scenarios. Just a few words about the methodological approach for calculating the climate emissions in these four different scenarios. We used sort of a bottom-up approach for different sectors. For food and housing, we based our numbers on previously published scenario studies. For transportation, we built new scenarios that were in line with these four scenarios. For other consumption, for the categories other consumption, public consumption, and investments, we developed new scenarios where current consumption were modified in line with the overall scenarios. We assumed that Sweden would be fossil-free in 2050 and other countries would be fossil-free to varying extents. And therefore, the level of import to Sweden becomes very important. So we had different levels of import in the different scenarios. We also have different levels and types of technological development in the scenarios, and we did not include any negative emissions. So I'll come back to that and the potential for that. So how did it work out? Did we fulfill the scenarios? Well, I'll have a pointer here. This line here, green line here, is sort of the level, the target level, 0.82 tons per capita per year. And we can say that all of the scenarios were roughly in line with that. But there are some differences. For food, the blue part here, in these three first scenarios, collaborative economy, circular economy, and automation, we assumed a vegan diet with varying levels of technological development in the scenarios. Whereas for local self-sufficiency, there were some meat included, locally produced at the local farms, etc. For buildings, we assumed used existent scenarios where all the housing had the same level of CO2 emissions, but the housing was kind of solved in different ways in the different scenarios. Transportation looks quite different in the different scenarios. For example, local self-sufficiency, very little transportation, more in the other scenarios. The private consumption, also very different in the scenarios. For example, automation, lots of IT equipment, of course, and in the collaborative economy, more of sharing stuff. So that is somewhat lower levels there. And then for public consumption and investments, also varying to some extent, where the lowest would be in local self-sufficiency. As I mentioned, no negative emissions here. If there would be room for negative emissions, that could then be used sort of to change, for example, dietary requirements to allow for some more meat, for example, not so strict vegan diets in those scenarios. It could also be used for having more traveling, etc., things that people would enjoy and like to have. Just to mention a few of the key assumptions in the different scenarios, the import share was lower than the current level in all scenarios, but to varying extent. Local self-sufficiency very much lower, automation not so much lower. Average emission intensity for imports of current levels were lower than current emissions to varying extent. Again, not so much in the local self-sufficiency scenario, but more significantly reduced in other scenarios, but still not assuming carbon neutral societies or lack of non-use of fossil fuels in other countries. The diets, as I mentioned, vegan in these scenarios and some meat in the local self-sufficiency. For all scenarios, they would change consumption levels to different extents. Typically reduced consumption of material products, but to some extent increased consumption of different types of services and culture, etc. And also important, international air travel were excluded in all scenarios. We didn't include that. So if there is room for negative emissions, that could, for example, be used to balance up international air travel. I guess there will be more about international air travel in coming presentations as well. Just some final reflections. It can be noted that radical changes are necessary, but also possible in these different scenarios. The scenarios are for 2050, so that means that the radical changes are not assumed to happen immediately, but with some time. Technological development is key, important in all scenarios, but not enough. That's coming clearly through. Interestingly, it was noted that different people have very different opinions about the scenarios. When we have presented these scenarios, many people have said that, well, one of the scenarios is the only relevant, but the others are completely unrealistic. But they differed very much about which ones they thought was the relevant and realistic scenarios. So there is a need for much more discussions about which kind of future scenarios are possible and wanted. And just to point out also that these are just 4 scenarios out of many possible. There could be many other scenarios developed. Thanks. Here are the key references for the paper for those interested. Thank you, Alan, there.
Thank you very much, Göran. And please do post your questions in the Q&A during the presentations as well, and then we'll try to answer as many as possible after we had all 4 presentations here. You can also note to whom you're asking. Now we'll move on to Claudia Hitai, who's a research associate at the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, who will present Luxembourg in Transition, Net Zero by 2050.
Thank you. Okay. Let me get my screen ready. Just a second. Okay. And start my presentation. Okay. So thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be talking about Luxembourg in Transition, which is a research project we just completed, which has as a focus the goal of reducing consumption-based carbon emissions. This slide shows really why we are all here. I mean, in blue, you have demand-based CO2 emissions exceeding production-based CO2 emissions for OECD countries, for rich countries, and the opposite for non-OECD countries. So in general, we have that rich countries tend to import carbon, while poorer countries tend to export carbon emissions. Now, for Luxembourg, we see here greenhouse gas emissions. In purple, we have production-based greenhouse gas emissions. In blue, we have consumption-based greenhouse gas emissions. Luxembourg is, of course, a very small country, also a very rich country. So we have a high consumption-based carbon footprint. But we also have a big steel and cement industry. So we also produce and export a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And in addition, a very large share of greenhouse gas emissions on the production side comes from transportation due to the low fuel taxes that we have. So I like showing this graph because we can see that the 2 accounting measures serve a different purpose. We, of course, report production-based emissions to the UNFCCC. This is subject to an official target, but we do not have an official target for consumption-based emissions, which is why this discussion in Sweden is so interesting to me. The consultation was launched by the Ministry of Energy and Spatial Planning, so really always looks at it through this lens of spatial planning, and we worked specifically with architects from the University of Luxembourg, so this was another interesting dimension for me. The consultation took place over 3 phases, and we just completed the 3rd and final phase. The goal was to decarbonize and to also respect other environmental and social constraints. So essentially to decarbonize in a resilient way. and it was inspired by similar consultations called Greater Paris and Greater Geneva. What did we have to do? What were the challenges we faced? So first, we had to calculate the carbon footprint of this Luxembourg and surroundings, which we called the functional area, based on where cross-border workers were living, because we have a large daily influx of workers into Luxembourg. We needed to define several interventions across multiple sectors. We calculated everything from the life cycle perspective, of course, focusing mainly on greenhouse gas emissions, but also local air pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus emissions, material use. And then we needed to combine all of these interventions together into a decarbonization path. In our case, to meet the 2 degrees scenario, we can, of course, dial them up to meet the 1.5 degree scenario. And as compared to what Joran Finnveden just showed us, we came up with only one scenario, though of course multiple scenarios are possible. And one additional challenge was that we needed to take into account the expected increase in population, which is sort of staggering, almost 50% increase in Luxembourg from 2020 to 2050. For the functional area as a whole, it was plus 15%. How did we go about this? So we started with each sector's contribution to the 2020 carbon footprint, which we calculated as the population-weighted average to get the carbon footprint of this functional area that you saw on the previous slide. We drew up a whole host or suite of interventions that are technologically feasible. So in terms of defining the scenario, we wanted to do what is possible with today's technology. And then we calculated the combined impact of these interventions. And then we dialed them up as necessary to meet the target. So in a sense, this scenario has kind of our, me and my colleagues' personal preferences baked into it. We thought this scenario would be most appealing to the population as a whole, but as we saw from Joran's talk, I think people have many very different opinions of what they think is preferable or feasible. So in future, we will be working at developing different kinds of scenarios. In terms of data, we of course base everything on the national inventories, and the JRC's EU reference scenarios. For food was Axio-based plus a paper by Behrens and colleagues in PNAS. And consumption goods and public services were based on bottom-up calculations that we did at LIST. Here you can see the results. So for this functional area, the carbon footprint, very high, almost 16 tons of CO2 per capita per year. And we needed to get this 90% reduction to meet the Paris Agreement target, which if you convert it, you look at the remaining carbon budget, increase in population, global population expected, amounts to about 1.6 tons. So sort of double what Joran just had of 0.8 tons. Again, wanted to emphasize that we were working with architects. Here you can see some of their designs. One of our big tenets was also to ensure no new net land take, no additional solar ceiling, reduce the living space, expand the tram network, and densify so that we can make the future public transportation system more efficient. So Luxembourg is really lacking a very good connected public transportation system. This was one of the challenges we faced. So in terms of decarbonization, here you can see energy demand from buildings in terawatt hours. The solid colors are always Luxembourg. The polka dotted colors are for the rest of the functional area. And what you can see is that we managed to reduce energy demand from buildings by 60% by reducing essentially the living area per person, but also through energetic renovations. And we shift away from fossil fuels, so away from natural gas in yellow and heating oil in brown to heat pumps in pink and electricity in purple. And then overall, you can see this reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 83%. So from 3.3 tons in 2020 to 0.5 tons per capita in 2050. In the mobility sector, very similar. We have two main principles: reducing the demand for transportation through telework, and then shifting the mode of transportation away from cars to soft mobility and public transportation. So in 2050, about half of the person kilometers will come from cars in orange, and 95% of those will be electric, and the remaining 20% from public transportation in blue, and then walking and biking you see in green and yellow. And again, we have this 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we can achieve. Luxembourg has a very large beef and dairy sector. Only 13% of land is used directly for fruit production. The rest is either grassland or crops for as feed. So our strategy was to maintain permanent grassland, but reduce feed production to shift to pasture-raised cattle. And this, of course, freed up more land for a more diversified crop mix. So we have additional benefits in terms of biodiversity, being less reliant on food imports. And we shift to agroecological or organic production methods. And our main strategy here was to shift to a flexitarian diet. So we did not yet go to a vegan diet, as we just saw in Nohrén's presentation, but we said essentially omnivore 1 day per week and vegetarian 6 days per week. And this reduces food-related emissions by 40%. On the carbon uptake side, we have a whole host of measures: green roofs, agroecological production methods for grassland and arable land, silvopasture, lots of hedges, hedgerows, so reducing the available agricultural land in favor of hedgerows, and riparian buffers, which have the added benefit of regulating water flow, helping with flooding. Here you see for the functional area, the carbon sequestration was 0.85 million tons in 2020, with forests acting as sink, and then new settlement area in black acting as net source of emissions. Since we have no new net land take, that goes to 0. And then you have our new measures here in blue and pink, and we achieve minus or 3.8 million tons of carbon sequestration per year, which on a per capita basis is about 1.6 tons. So when it comes to putting everything together, we have these mobility combined measures that I mentioned, increasing the fuel tax, reducing flights per person. On the building side, what I talked about, the diet shift, consumption goods, reducing consumption by almost 90%, decarbonizing public services, decarbonizing the electricity sector, and some remaining measures when it comes to freight and refrigeration. And what we end up with is we do meet our target of 1.6. And what I highlight here is that some of the measures can be considered more public or systemic in nature in blue, others are behavioral, individual, and then some are combined in green. And if we think about it, had we only done those that are public systemic, we would still be left with 6.3 tons of CO2 per capita in 2050. Conversely, if we did only the individual behavioral ones, we would still be left with 5.9. We really need both of these levers to achieve our target. So I will leave it there since I am out of time. Here are my conclusions. I'm really happy to be part of this where we are talking about consumption-based accounting and how important it is to have a target on consumption-based emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And now we'll move on to Magnus Bengtsson, the policy lead for Hot or Cool Institute. And it's going to present 1.5 degree lifestyles converging toward a fair consumption space. So you can continue to pose questions to all the researchers in the Q&A. You can go ahead and share your screen, Magnus.
Thank you very much, Robert. Trying to locate my the right screen to share. Okay, I think you got it now.
Yes.
Excellent. Let's see if we can switch to center mode. All right. So thank you very much. We have heard some very interesting presentations, I think. I will present some work that our institute has been doing on 1.5 degree lifestyles, a methodology that we have developed for a number of years, and we recently published a new report in this series. So in this extended project, which started sometime around 2017-18, we do analysis of pathways for shrinking what we call lifestyle carbon footprints, and I will talk a bit more about that in a while, using country-specific bottom-up data on behavior and carbon intensities. And the work covers 6 lifestyle domains. We are looking at food and beverage, housing, transportation, personal transportation, consumer goods, leisure, and services. So the first publication came out already in 2019, covering only 5 countries. Now, more recently, we had the opportunity to do an update and to include 5 more countries. So in total, 10 countries covered in this recent report. Came out just last November. And you can see it there on the left-hand side, and you can download everything you see here from our website. So for the calculation method here, I said that we do bottom-up analysis, and we do that for 3 of these areas of consumption or lifestyle domains, for food and beverage, housing, and personal transportation. So there we collect data on diets, food consumption, how much an average person eats of major categories of food. And then we use LCA data on the greenhouse gas emissions from producing those different types of food. And then we put those data categories together to calculate the carbon emissions related with this particular country-specific diet. And then we use a similar approach for housing, where we have data on residential floor space and household energy consumption, also then combined with LCA data. And for personal transportation, where we have data both on distance traveled and the modal share, so which means how much people are using a private car, bus, airplane, etc. Then for the 3 remaining categories, we use a more conventional approach, where we use a multi-region input-output model, the XU-base, which some of you may be familiar with. So we then combine this. And the strengths of doing it this way, of using this bottom-up data on behaviors or consumption or lifestyles and the carbon intensities, is that then we can analyze this separately to see how we are shrinking demand or how we are improving the efficiency and reducing the carbon intensity of production systems. So we can easily create scenarios and to see what kind of combinations of changes can actually meet the long-term targets. So here are the long-term targets I talked about, short-term and long-term targets. So based on the work reviewed by the IPCC, this is from the 1.5 special report published in 2018. One of the main scenarios that they are using there. And the lifestyle carbon footprint here, we, based on the literature, we estimate it as roughly 70% of the total carbon footprint for a country. There are also other parts of countries' emissions from public investments, for example, military activities and other such things that cannot easily be allocated to the lifestyles of individuals. But these are the targets that we come to here when we look at how much we need to reduce over the coming decades. So by 2030, globally, we would need to go down to 2.5 tons per capita per year, and 2050, all the way down to 0.7. So then to the data, and this picture here covers, kind of captures in a high-level way the kind of the big picture of what we saw in this analysis. You can see the 10 countries, the carbon emissions currently for each of these consumption domains. And you can see also the targets here for 2030, 2050. Some observations here, we can see that the food, housing, and transport dominate strongly. They are responsible for more than 70% in, I think, all countries. We can also see that for high-income countries, things like consumer goods, leisure, and services, these things that are not really maybe essential for survival, but that people tend to consume when they have some more money to spend, they become quite significant also in high-income countries. We can also see that there is an extreme inequality. Here we see, of course, just the differences between the average of different countries. Then, of course, there is also a staggering inequality within each of these countries, but we don't see this in the data here. But we can also see that, I mean, we are very well aware that high-income countries need to make drastic reductions in carbon emissions, but we also see that also middle-income countries like China, South Africa, also will need to make significant cuts already until 2030 if we want to follow the pathway to 1.5 degree, which of course will be extremely challenging. We can also see, this is an example of, we can look more in detail at data here. For example, on food, we can see here for each country how the food footprint is made up. You can see that meat is the dominant factor in most countries. Dairy products are actually more than most people are aware of, especially in countries with a kind of Western style diet. There are also large emissions from rice production in countries where rice is commonly eaten on a everyday basis. I'm going through this a little bit quickly because time is running. Just want to show a little bit what types of data and findings are in the report. Here you can see that we have separated the modes of transport and the number of kilometers that an average person travels per year in case of Finland. And we have also the carbon intensity of each of these types of transport. So then the area of each of these parts you see here in the graph represents the carbon emissions. So we have the green dotted rectangle there showing the current carbon footprint from transport, and it would need to shrink down to the red rectangle in the 2030. And that can be achieved in various ways. We see that we can improve the efficiency of these options. We can reduce the demand, travel less, or we can do a modal shift. We can shift from more carbon intensive types of transport to less carbon intensive. And we can play around with these different options and try to see how we can fit it within this box in the left-hand corner. So it's not a matter of choosing the one or the other. Actually, these three strategies are all necessary and need to be pursued simultaneously. Especially in high-income countries, we don't have the luxury of just doing one of these things. We actually need to do everything we can along all these strategies. One aspect that we emphasize strongly in our report, it's already highlighted in the title, is the need to think about fairness when it comes to this dramatic transition that we are now entering. We need to recognize that there is such a thing as overconsumption, but we also need to consider the people who are currently under-consuming, that actually need to consume more. And we need to raise these ethical issues of how we actually divide up this limited carbon budget globally in a fair and equitable manner, and how we set priorities. But we need to put fairness at the center of all these debates about climate change. Otherwise, this is not going to work out politically and to get public acceptance. And what we say in the report also in the final section, we highlight a number of policy approaches that are currently not much used, but that we think may become necessary. We are talking about things like choice editing, governments removing certain carbon intensive options from the market, things that have excessively high emissions of carbon. I'm a bit surprised that actually things like space tourism is happening. It shouldn't be happening given the situation we are in. But that's an extreme example. There are many other areas where governments could play a more active role in shaping the market and the options that are available for us to consume. We're also talking about the possibility of rationing certain carbon intensive products, that each individual only has the right to consume a certain amount of these products per month or year. We are talking about universal basic services and the need to look beyond GDP growth, sufficiency, and look more at multidimensional well-being as a way of understanding societal progress. And we are now working on follow-up work already. Just Monday this week, we launched a policy brief where we look more in detail at this choice editing approach I just talked about. We co-published with UNEP a policy brief on choice editing, and we will continue to work on that concept. And we recently also published a think piece together with Sustainable Europe Research Institute Germany, where we look at rationing as a possibility. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Magnus. And to the panelists, some of the questions coming in, I think you could answer also directly in the chat. So since some of them are very detailed, we might not be able to cover all of them. So last but not least, Jörgen Larsson, Associate Professor at Chalmers University of Technology. I'm going to talk about neither technology nor behavioral changes will save the climate. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I make this claim on that neither technology nor behavioral changes will be enough, based on a report that we recently published. It's called Consumption-Based Scenarios for Sweden, a basis for discussing new climate targets. And we made this for this Swedish cross-party committee that Emma described before. So I was one of the experts in that investigation, and also I led this work together with Johannes Moorfelt, and we were a group of 12 researchers that did this work, and I will briefly describe some of the results. And as you know, you can differentiate between territorial and consumption-based emissions, and in the Swedish case, it's much larger for the consumption-based emissions, since we import a lot and we have low emissions from our energy system. And we looked into where do these 9 tons occur, and we see that 36% come from within Sweden, 22% from other EU ETS countries, and 42% from the rest of the world. And this 42%, they are really a strong argument for having a target to reduce these emissions, because the emissions in Sweden and in the other ETS countries, for these emissions, there are policies in place which will reduce these emissions, hopefully, if the policies are fulfilled as planned. But for the rest of the world, the emissions in the rest of the world, the emissions occurring in Russia, in India, China, etc., for these emissions, there are little hope of any major reduction in the coming decades. So, and that's one of the reasons behind it. What we did in our scenario was we used an approach, which a bottom-up approach, where we started with the statistics in 2019, and we made very detailed modeling of specific technological changes. For example, when it comes to car driving, we made assumptions of how fast the introduction of electric vehicles will be. We have assumptions of what the emissions per kilowatt hour for the electric vehicle will be, and also for the emissions from the production of the electric vehicles, including the battery. So it's very detailed analysis for the most important areas. And in addition to this, we also made analysis of changes in consumption volume, in this case, number of kilometers driven. And we include passenger transport, food, and the construction of housing and infrastructure. We did not include, I have to move here, other private consumption areas such as clothing and electronics, and also not company investments, and also not negative emissions, which is of course a possibility in theory at least to reduce consumption-based emissions. And as we did this as a basis for the politicians, we wanted to relate it to the existing territorial climate target. We have in Sweden this, as Emma mentioned, a territorial target to be net zero by 2045, and in practice that means minus 85% in emissions here, plus negative emissions. And to achieve this 85%, we need a range of changes. For example, no fossil fuels, that food production emissions are decreasing through higher productivity and methane reduction initiatives. And for example, for cement, we assume in our scenarios here that 100% of the cement used coming from Sweden uses a CCS technology. And the same for steel, it's a fossil-free steel. But in this scenario, we assume that the air travel volume will increase with the historical rates, meaning leading to a doubling of air travel volumes by 2050. So we calculated what do these changes and many, many more changes, what would that lead to in terms of consumption-based emissions? And we found that it would decrease the emissions by in total 48%. So this is what a technological focus in the climate policy in the future could lead to. But as you know, the consumption-based emissions, they are very dependent on the development in the rest of the world. So we also made an optimistic scenario where we assume that the rest of the world would follow a so-called sustainable development scenario, as the International Energy Agency calls it, which would lead to global net greenhouse gas emissions reaching zero by 2070. And if we assume this optimistic future, then the emissions would be 72% less than in 2019. So this is pretty much in line with what the politicians have proposed for this new consumption-based target, that we will reach it through technological changes and assuming that the rest of the world is really going for a global climate transition, which could be a bit optimistic. Then we also calculated the effect from a behavioral change scenario. We included a range of different changes. For example, that air travel volume would be cut in half compared to 2019. Car travel decreased by 20%, doubling of public transport. That housing space per person average would decrease by 10%. And that beef and milk would be reduced by 75%, which is kind of in line with the Eat Lancet. And but we will, in this scenario, we combined it with the current technological trends, meaning a slow improvement, and also only that current stated policies are implemented and no global transition is taking place. This we find would lead to a reduction by 66%. So more than the technological based scenario, but perhaps not sufficient. And then we also did a a combined scenario, a technology and behavioral scenario. So here we assumed all the technological changes in the first scenario and the behavioral changes in the second scenario. And here we see between 80 and 90% reduction compared to the base year, depending on the development in the rest of the world. If the rest of the world is going for this for a global climate transition, then this scenario is a 90% reduction. So, and you could say that this is well, I mean, the policies needed to realize this is of course very drastic, but you could also say that it's kind of in line with the modern life that we live today. We for example here assume a continuing increase in private consumption with 2% per year, and so it's not a totally new lifestyle. Although for example, we will not fly more than we did in the 1990s. We will not continue with the doubling. So it's you could call it a radical one, but you could also see that this is not so radical. This is just going for the for changing the most climate intense consumption patterns. So to sum up, the scenarios with the technological focus leading to 48 to 72% reduction, and the behavioral ones 66%. So neither of these, I would say, are strong enough to be in line with the 1.5 degree scenario, while the combined one, where we go for both radical technological innovation and behavioral changes, there you could say that it is in line with the 1.5 degree scenarios by IPCC. So with that, I thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jörgen. So all presenters and researchers could turn on the camera if you like to. We have a 10-minute Q&A. Getting some questions in. You can ask more questions during the session as well. Let me just first start with a question. So most of these or all of these scenarios assume that there are behavioral changes and also reductions in consumption. But people hear a lot about electric cars and fossil-free steel and fossil-free cement and sustainable aviation fuels, and maybe think that's enough. What are the key reasons for that there's a need for also behavioral change? If you want to go, Jörgen, you can go. Otherwise, if someone else wants to jump in, that's fine too.
Well, you asked me to start. Well, I would say that just for the technological solutions is a risky way, because we might not manage to realize these theoretical potentials. So, and then we could risk missing the climate, the Paris targets. So going for both strategies combined makes it a more resilient climate policy regime.
Yeah, I can only agree. I mean, it's we really saw that if we don't go for behavioral change, if we don't reduce consumption, there's no way we can meet that target. So I think this was a really important lesson for Luxembourg. And also another lesson was that we need to have this overarching picture of what needs to be done across all sectors, across all actors, because otherwise every ministry is doing its own thing and doesn't realize the level of effort that is required. So people don't realize the level of effort that they need to do. The different parts of government don't realize the level of effort. So I think this was one of the main lessons we took from this, that we need more coordination, and we need to tell people and the different actors, industry, government, what they need to do so that we can hit this target.
And that was also one of the conclusions that we draw. We looked at this explicitly and made for the high-income countries two stylized scenarios where we try to rely mainly on reduction in carbon intensity, and the other one we try to make quite drastic changes in demand in behavior. But it was only when we combined those, when we actually took aggressive action both on the technology and on the behavior, that we actually managed to meet the target. So it's not a matter of either or, it's a matter of both.
Well, that's very clear. And we have a follow-up question saying that there are many examples. I mean, we're having lifestyle change, but they're asking, how could this happen on a large scale in just a few decades? What are the incentives for people to do behavior change? Is it enough with motivation or information, or do you need stricter regulations, incentives, like you mentioned, choice editing and rationing, etc.? So there's and also asking if there's studies on how people can make these kind of drastic behavioral changes. So this is directed to everyone, so whoever wants to start.
I think if I start, I think it's clear that there is a need. This will not happen spontaneously. There is a need for policies creating incentives. And I think it's important to realize that we've seen lifestyle changes occurring during the last decades. For example, the amount of meat consumed has increased significantly. The amount of air traveling has increased significantly. So we can also make changes the other way around. Another type of change that I often refer to is smoking. Like 3 decades ago, it was common practice to smoke in workplaces, and that wouldn't happen today. And that's a huge lifestyle change for some of us, at least, during this period. So it can, and it has come through a mixture of information, economic policy instruments, and regulation. And I think that's needed here as well.
And we have another question from the audience on so moving forward, if you could reflect a bit on what an everyday life would look like and feel like with some of these scenarios where there have been very large behavioral changes.
I recommend everyone to look at this luxembourgintransition.com website, because the report that we did, especially the phase 2 report, is huge but interesting reading, and we have these sections where we kind of describe what life would be like. And I think this is a great follow-up question to what the previous one, how can you induce behavioral change? Do you really need to have a narrative and paint the picture of what the future would look like? But I think it really is tied to infrastructure changes, especially when it comes to transportation, when it comes to buildings. So there are certain things that need to happen to make this behavioral changes possible. And the way the future will look like is very different, you know, a lot more bike paths, more work from home. So the day-to-day life will look different, but will have many positive aspects as well.
Yeah. We had several questions on food, so I want to bring that up. There's one specific to Göran's scenarios for diets. What was the reasoning behind choosing fully vegan diets rather than the example of the ones proposed in Eat Lancet or One Planet Food?
Well, Eat Lancet wasn't published at the time, so we couldn't choose that. Vegan food, the scenarios for vegan food were those that had the lowest climate impact, so it was needed to get into the overall carbon budget there.
Yeah. So there's also some questions about the possibility to compare scenarios. How can you calculate citizen footprint goals? Can you compare them between the different sort of approaches? Some might include public services, some might not. Yeah, does anyone want to reflect on that?
No, just to the extent that that is the next step. So listening to these presentations, I was already thinking, how are their assumptions different, or how are their interventions stronger or weaker than ours? I think we saw it mainly with the diets and with consumption goods. So it would be a good idea, I think, after this to align and to see, you know, what we can learn from these different scenarios.
Yeah. All right. I think we we need to move on to the panel because one panelist have to leave quite soon. But if you stay on, then we could perhaps direct some more questions to you at the end as well, and you can answer live as well, written in the chat. So for the panel, we're going to bring up Åsa Persson as the research director of Stockholm Environmental Institute. Doris Fuchs, who's the professor at International Relations and Sustainable Development at the University of Münster. Emma Nohrén, who's the chair of the Parliamentary Committee. Oksana Mont, professor in Sustainable Consumption Governance at Lund. And Jorge Laguna Celis, who's the head of the 10-year framework on programs of sustainable consumption and production patterns at UN Environment. So you're all welcome to turn on your cameras and unmute. And we're going to discuss a little bit around these proposed targets for consumption-based emissions and also these presentations that we've been seeing and what the implications are for that. So Jorge, I know you have to leave in a few minutes. Let's see. Yeah, here you are.
I have to leave, much to my regret, Robert, because I would like to stay in this conversation. You are having a central and discussing a key topic. First of all, I just landed this morning from Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire from the Convention on Desertification. The first topic that the convention addressed for the opening of its high-level segment was about what is the role of consumption. How can we guide consumption? There is an unprecedented level of international attention, owing also, and we're seeing it in the latest IPCC report, to the importance that choices have. While in Abidjan, I had a conversation, and I'll start with this anecdote, with President Tarja Halonen, the 11th president of Finland, first woman president, a truly amazing leader. She was reflecting that in her youth, her family would eat meat only once a week. Today, we are waging, would say, a battle in different levels to shift the curve, to at least convince procurement agencies that are providing food in schools to at least make one day vegetarian, right? Can culture and lifestyles change? Yes, we have evidence. The colleague that mentioned in the previous panel, smoking became unacceptable, socially unacceptable. What created that transition? The international community has not sufficiently worked and taken behavioral economics seriously, has not looked seriously at the impact that choices and the way we guide choices through policies can have. Those areas that are with consumer information, lifestyles and education, sustainable procurement, and the way we influence the choices through media and marketing. We need to create a broad coalition and an important engagement. We see the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, colleagues, as this opportunity to really keep on lifting that agenda unashamedly. We need to promote a radical new approach towards consumption. I would also say that this radical new approach has to be also seen from the element of fairness and equity. Despite the fact that we have progressed globally in terms of access to consumption and aspirational aspects that are there, we have not done enough in creating a safe operating space. The discussions that I invite you to take from your national perspective have to consider that element of fairness. Some need to consume a little bit more. Others, many others, need to consume less. Everyone needs to consume differently. And I will stop here just mentioning a very interesting publication that we launched through our program on sustainable lifestyles and education in partnership with the Hot and Cool Institute. Wonderful report. It's called Sustainable Lifestyles in a Climate Emergency. This report advocates for 5 actions, 5 very simple actions that can be taken. And it's very much what you've been discussing. But it brings a new concept that it's relatively new for the United Nations, not for you that are experts and specialists and we learn from you, is this idea of choice editing. We need to create a space in which the multilateral environment, the United Nations, the institutions that we represent that bring all countries and actors on board, can take discussions on choice editing, meaning the policies that can help guide those choices on the high impact sectors. One, on mobility. The second one on housing. The third one on diets. The fourth one on textiles and fashion, what we dress. If we manage to create standards, approaches, principles, partnerships, and coalitions that will address those 4 high impact sectors, changing the way we move, changing the way we consume fashion, changing the way we eat, or just changing, going back to the way we were eating probably just 20, 30 years ago, I think that we can see a great contribution. But this cannot be put solely in the shoulders of consumers. It needs to be supported by policy, supported by finance, supported by incentives, and especially by the wonderful academia. My last pitch is, we want to see you, all of you, in the One Planet Network Forum in Stockholm. We will be hosting in 31st of May, 1st of June, as a contribution to support this agenda on consumption, agenda on sustainable production for a radical new approach towards sustainability. So I congratulate you. This is a very valuable discussion. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much for those remarks. And if you have a minute, I would also be interested in hearing sort of your take on the Swedish proposal for consumption targets from an international perspective. How do you see them, and what kind of implications do you think they can have? Can it spread to other countries and so on?
Sweden has a component that it's admirable. One, Sweden has taken a very bold step in assessing the impacts of the national consumption beyond Sweden. Sweden is taking the responsibility, very courageous, to look that the way Swedish people, consumers, are consuming industries have ramifications that are impacting elsewhere. Few countries in the world have taken that radical step. Few countries in the world have actually set in their law targets for fair consumption, not only looking at the national level, but looking based on. The third one is that you are basing your decisions on science. I was privileged to listen what the Prince Project is doing. It is remarkable. We have similar tools that we want to bring, and it is inspiring that there is a great committee, that all the director generals that are involved in the consumption, the production of angles of the Swedish government are working on these choice editing policies, are getting together, are discussing how to create an appropriate, adequate environment that serves to all. We will be learning from them, but also they will come and learn from us. And I think it's good that the way you set up in 1972, this idea that we had to look towards future generations, that same umbrella of having that sense of global solidarity, of looking at how do we rethink our models of consumption and production from that leadership perspective of Sweden, it's important. Of course, a long way is ahead. Sweden is still way beyond consuming more than the resources that we have, like every other country in the world. So a lot is to be done, but I can say from my standpoint that I see very positive signals, and we look forward to greater leadership from all actors in Swedish society.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to have you here to give that perspective. So the same question, I'm interested, Doris Fuchs, how do you, we always love international perspectives on Sweden, right? So like, how do you view this proposed consumption target? Do you think it will have spread also to other countries, will inspire others? And yeah, your general thoughts around that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. First of all, and fundamentally, I have to say that these targets, they are highly necessary, they're highly relevant. For completeness, I have to say they don't just exist in Sweden. Germany is on the same path. We have a consumption target since last year. We're currently developing indicators and strategies for how to pursue it, and that's still a long target ahead. So a lot is going on, but it doesn't matter of who's first or not. The important part is we're doing it because it's so necessary and so relevant to put the focus where it needs to be. It needs to be on consumption. It needs to be on overconsumption as the main driver of unsustainability today. And I hope that the benefit of these targets and associated indicators then will be that we do not watch just how consumption footprints develop, but that we also honestly ask ourselves what is driving them and what can we do about it. And what can we do about it, not just by 2050, which will be too late, but what can we do about it now and in the very near future? And that's where it becomes even harder, right? That's where even more politics come into the game. And the honest answer that we'll have to give is that if we want to do something about this, we'll have to talk about consumption limits. And we have to be very clear about the need to talk about consumption limits. We need to, and Jürgen also addressed this, and the other presentations, we need to focus on consumption volumes rather than just efficiency. Because we've known now for decades that efficiency by itself doesn't do the trick. And in fact, just focusing on efficiency is more of a distraction because it suggests we're making progress when we're not making progress. And so we need to start by talking about consumption volumes, especially for the resource-intensive products and services. And very much what Magnus also there. And we then need to use efficiency to improve the footprint of the remaining consumption and not the other way around. And that's what all of sustainable consumption research tells you today. It's whether you use a consumption corridors approach or 1.5 lifestyles perspectives that Magnus presented and that we're also using in a Horizon 2020 project that I'm coordinating, and Oksana, who's also on the panel here, is part of, and I saw that other partners and advisory board members are here today, or whether you use the sufficiency lens, which you also do in Swedish projects I've seen, or in European or international projects. All of these projects will tell you in the end, it's about talking about volumes of consumption, talking about limits, talking about what is enough. And so the bottom line, and coming back to what the title of the webinar is today, a radical new consumption, the bottom line is that if we take these targets and if we take relevant indicators seriously, then we'll have to organize systems of provisioning and consuming from a needs-based perspective, with minimum but also maximum consumption limits. And we'll have to move away from consumption that is intended to absorb surplus production. And we need to move away from an advertising system that uses the best trained psychologists and billions of dollars to get consumers to buy more than they need, and in fact more than they want if left to their own devices. And that's what makes these targets so important, because hopefully it will make us think these things through and come back to what is really needed in terms of also political change, because all behavioral choices are politically embedded. And yes, it is very much not just about planetary health, but it's also an issue of justice, and we have to emphasize that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Åsa or Oksana, maybe if you also would like to comment just maybe briefly on how you view this target and what do you think we will actually lead to?
I can go first, maybe. So good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here. And I was really happy to hear Jorge mention Stockholm Plus 50 as well, which we are also busy preparing for at the Stockholm Environment Institute. And I fully agree. I think it feels like maybe we're approaching a tipping point when it comes to really taking that next step with sustainable consumption and production. So I have a few thoughts on the Swedish target, but I just wanted to, because it's such an exciting discussion, pick up very briefly on a couple of points that have been made. First of all, I think we're also excited about bringing up this issue, and happy to hear that this wonderful research will be presented at Stockholm Plus 50, because typically you see this as a local or national policy area, but we really think there's a need for that global international movement, because to kind of reduce the first mover risk of countries. So if you remember when big cities started setting these bans for driving diesel vehicles in the city centers, a lot of other cities followed. So that kind of diffusion effect, imitation, I think is really important. And also leading by example, seeing that it can be done somewhere. A second point to pick up on, we heard about fairness. We agree that's really important. And I think in addition to looking at the global, international sort of fairness perspective, also really important to consider it domestically. So for example, in Sweden, also SEI recently presented data on a postcode level, actually, looking at how different residential areas have different emission profiles in their consumption behavior. We know that rural areas, of course, have much higher transport emissions and so on. So we need to be very sensitive to that, and also I think translate the whole just transition discourse, which has been mainly used when it comes to fossil fuel sort of extraction debates, to try and apply that kind of thinking also when it comes to consumption behaviors. A third final point I wanted to pick up on also, when we heard about limits and corridors, and I'm not a behavioral scientist, but as a policy and governance scholar, I would just want to guess or test the idea that maybe are bans more socially acceptable than limits. Again, coming back to this example of banning diesel cars, setting these future dates when you can't buy or drive diesel cars in cities, seems more acceptable perhaps than starting to talk about these limits, because then you immediately start discussing how to share that limit, how do we distribute it fairly among, and what are the rations, etc. So I think that's a question for discussion. Very briefly on the targets, I'm optimistic again for this diffusion effect it could have. We have seen it with net zero targets, for example, that we now have net zero targets covering 90% of global emissions, and this happened in maybe less than 2 years. But also a little bit pessimistic, because still this is just a target, and as a political scientist, I feel it's very much about the policy instruments that are going to implement the target. That's where you're going to have the most conflicts probably, and that's also where the action is going to happen. So it remains to be seen, of course, how powerful instruments and actions will be implemented to actually achieve the targets. But if there are these sort of credible threats of quite stringent instruments, I do think it can lead to anticipatory action from a range of domestic emitters, but perhaps also emitters in other countries that we import products from. I'll stop here for now, but it's a really interesting discussion.
A lot of exciting points there to follow up on. So Oksana, I would like to hear from you as well.
Yes, absolutely. Really very inspiring and very nice, not only initiative, but also fantastic to hear all these experts looking at this, setting up targets from these different perspectives. And of course, just to reiterate that setting targets is the first step. Operationalizing, how do we reach these targets, to what means, at which levels? This is where the hard work begins, and I'm happy to hear that in Germany this work is on the way, so we will not have to be the first, but maybe learn something also at the beginning in the first steps. But for me, it's also, I'm thinking then targets, we need to operationalize them through indicators and also the policies. And in that sense, hearing all these different types of projects that are going on and that take up these scenarios. A lot of these scenarios, this reminds me, it's a 10-year-old project on Spread 2050, Sustainable Lifestyles 2050 EU project, where very similar scenarios were taking up. And from that work, what I took on is it's important then also to see that there are different consumer groups who are interested in different types of lifestyles, so having different aspects of life more important to them than for other groups, which gives us an opportunity, thinking about the macro level targets, to see what percentage of that scenario can fit in the common picture. So we can also play not only having this is the scenario and whether it will take us to the target or not, but we can also combine and have a kind of spectrum of scenarios which might eventually get us to 90 degrees reduction. So this is one thing, and it also is very much supported with the consumer psychology and sociology, that there are different groups of people. For some people, it's really important, more sustainable diets, and they're much ready to give up mobility. For other people, mobility is the core of their life, and so they would rather keep driving, but then try to reduce their impacts on, say, clothing consumption. One important thing that I don't think we've highlighted a lot today is the role of income, and that has to do with the setting limits on consumption, because you give people more money, we will consume. So how do we introduce income reductions in an acceptable way? And I think here is the role of time. We are all pressed for time. This is the most critical resource that all of us humans have. So I think something there, working with income versus time, can also be a way to increase acceptance of different scenarios that we've heard about today. And finally, on the thread of improving acceptance, I think a lot of also consumer psychology now is talking about that it doesn't necessarily takes generations to change consumer values. As long as you put people in a situation, as with Corona, for example, where they can test, adopt, and try on a certain behavior, then the behavioral change can come first, and then the values and acceptance can come as a second stage, which tells us also that normalization and institutionalization of more sustainable lifestyles doesn't need to take ages. It can happen rather quickly, as long as we have the favorable conditions and kind of acceptance in the society. And I guess the sense of urgency plays an important role in that. And I think that's where we're also getting more and more of. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to pose a question to you, Emma. How much was discussed in the Parliamentary Committee about what happens next in terms of policies and sort of ways to bring about this change? Was that something you had part of your discussions and work that can be picked up later?
We had a lot of discussions and a lot of different suggestions on the table, but we realized that the work with the targets took a lot of time, and something that was always asked for was more data and statistics, because you want to make the right choice. We see now that cities, municipalities, and regions in Sweden have already taken their own targets before we do the national targets, but they are also asking for the data and statistics for their region. Also told you about this postcode thing, and that is something that is needed, so that you do, if you're looking into food, is that the biggest thing in our city, or is it transportation? And so you're starting with the low-hanging fruit. But when it comes to the national legislators, we had a lot, as I said, to discuss, but we couldn't really handle it. It was too short amount of time, and so many different, it's transportation, aviation, shipping, IT, technology, everything. So we said that we will try to make really good targets, or as good as we can with the data we have, but we have to make the other work now. Now we know where we're heading and we have to fill it. And of course, there is quite a lot of differences between the parties on how to, what is the way to go now. But there is a will to do it, and that is something positive. And I also picked up, I don't know who he said, I think it was that sometimes a ban is more effective than limits. And I think that's quite true. And I think it's research behind that too. But what we saw in our discussion was that when we saw a problem, we often talk about how to make that in a different way. But when we say that we should do less or reduce, then it was hard for policymakers to say that you should reduce this or ban this, even if that is more efficient way. And also something that we talked about, heading forward where we have to go doesn't mean that we go backwards. It's just a different way of living. And we have done it before. We have heard many examples here. Evolution is going fast. And we don't need to say that something doing less of what we do today is wrong or bad. We just have to make it in a different way. And who don't want to have a life in a world where you have healthy air and clean water? I mean, that's something everybody should aim for. And that is a lot of goods in that too.
Thank you. It was very interesting to hear the insights, inside voice also of the discussions, the political discussions that's ongoing. So if we move on also to talk more about policies, so it's clear that there is a need for behavioral change. It's not just the technological changes, and some of them are quite radical. We heard about reduced living area, reduced international travel, reduced consumption of animal foods, setting perhaps max consumption levels, even perhaps reduced incomes. But what are the concrete policy proposals that could be sort of used to bring about changes like this? Examples that you've seen or that you come across that could be put on the table? And I pose the question to everyone, too. Anyone can jump in.
Maybe I start unless somebody else wants to start.
Yes.
Well, I think something is happening in advertising. It's slow, as it is in all areas, but at least it's happening, right? With Geneva banning advertising in public spaces, with France requiring advertising for cars to mention something about consider walking or taking the train. And you can always argue about how effective that is. And we have these arguments with all the advertising, anti-advertising that's necessary on cigarettes these days and on tobacco. But still something is happening there. And I do think that we need to focus on making it clear how much advertising, not just of alcohol, not just of tobacco, is harmful to society and society's future. And that we can think about taking a totally different approach there, tax advertising rather than make it deductible for businesses, forbid advertising for more products and so on. So I think that's one area where things are starting to happen, too slow, definitely, but hopefully we can use that.
Jürgen, I see you unmuted, on camera yourself. So I saw you made a comment on reducing the emissions. Maybe you want to tell everyone about
it. Did you ask me?
Yeah. Since you turned on your camera, I thought maybe you want to say the comment that you had in the chat or in the Q&A.
Yes, I have a comment. In groups like this, there's often unclarity of what we mean with decreasing consumption, and I believe the talk about decreasing total consumption through through degrowth of the total economy is a risky business when it comes to social sustainability, employment, etc. And I think also it might be unnecessary for reaching the climate targets. So I think it's much more smarter to go for targeting decreasing consumption for specific climate intense products and services like air travel, meat and dairy products mainly, and also the type of products that will not be decarbonized in the coming decades. So I think it's much easier to get acceptance for this among politicians and voters, and I also think we have the policy instruments in place. We have today about 200% tax on fuels and on cigarettes and on alcohol. If we would put this also for air tickets and for meat, we could reduce taxes on other types of consumption, which would benefit low-income earners in total. So we have these policy instruments in place, or we have experience from them. So that's how I thought about it.
Yeah, thank you. So Doris, you raised your hand, and then I also want to see if Åsa and Oksana has specific policy proposals that you like to bring forward. Please.
Yeah, I just like to respond directly, because I think that we need to talk about limits, that I think everything else is dishonest, and we can talk about limits in the specific areas you mentioned, right? The most resource intensive products and services, rather than across the board, and that will perhaps help acceptance. I found Asa's comment also very interesting, to say bans maybe easier than limits, and you know, I think that in some cases that may be true. I don't think it's true in all cases. We're not going to talk about banning international flights, right? And we're going to talk about limiting them, but certainly implementing bans is going to be much easier than organizing and implementing limits. So I'm not opposed to, you know, saying certain things we want to ban, and with other things we have to talk about limits. But I do think in the end we will have to talk about limits in some areas.
So Emma, do you want to come in on that specific topic before we move on to more policies, since you raised your hand? Now you're muted.
I think Åsa was ahead of me, but if I can just jump in, I can say that I'm a marine biologist from the beginning, and I ended up in politics to try to save the oceans, and now we are in this field instead. And I just want to say that I've been in national politics 10 years at least, and this is the hardest political issue I have ever come upon. It goes directly into the political party's ideology and the ideology behind it. And something, it's of course you can ban things, of course you can put limits, and you have others that said, no, you should put the right price on the emission and that will solve it. And we have all this difference, and it's very, very ideology and party based on what solutions that suits you. And we need to have this, because we have solutions and we have these objectives that we will take needs to last for a long time. We cannot have a shift. And I also have to say that we need to have the businesses, trade and services with us, and we need to make sure that we can use them in the transition. Now I will be quiet.
Thank you. So Åsa.
Yes, I just wanted to elaborate a bit this idea that maybe, you know, are bans more effective than limits sometimes. Of course, it's a complicated issue and so on. And I really think limits are very important, you know, as a communication tool to give a sense of the order of magnitude of the challenge, and to have these quantitative kind of guardrails. I really, really appreciated the work also this 1.5 degree lifestyles, because it gives you that benchmark. But at the same time, when I have sort of observed policy-making processes, if when you have that sort of quantitative limits, it's almost an invitation to start negotiating who should take, you know, responsibility, how much. That becomes the logic, and if, you know, companies, they want to minimize the harm to their incomes and business model. But if you instead announce these future bans, for example, which have to be, you know, you can't obviously ban food or things like that, but sort of maybe short-haul domestic flights like in France. That's something that I think could maybe optimistically inspire more of that sort of technological shift thinking, and you know, businesses reconsidering strategy, like, or all the car manufacturers are now on board with the electric vehicles. So it's a little bit the kind of logic that you present. And just on that note, a final comment from me, what I find very interesting also is work on the motivation profiles, why individuals, why we choose to consume sustainably or not. Really interesting psychological research that show that you know, very seldom it's actually the environmental motivation that our sustainability research, you know, is focused on, but it could be other things, like you want to be that sort of sorry, I lose English words, but save your money, or be sort of technological pioneer, you know, use some new app. So I think that's also another side of the coin. Think about more what triggers people, and there's plenty of interesting research on that, I think, also within the Mr. Sustainable Consumption team. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Oksana, you want to come in?
Yeah, very shortly, linking well to the previous speakers. For me, it's not either or. Is it a ban or just information provision? For me, it's useful to think in terms of policy packages, where if you want to introduce a hard measure, a ban, you can always accompany it with economic and then support with information measure. And then you can kind of design these packages. It can have the same hard core, but the surrounding instruments you can profile to suit the different groups of people, consumers or citizens, and then increase acceptance and effectiveness of this policy tool. So I think it's important to think in these terms, not only to design or look for a silver bullet, a perfect policy, because none of them works for everybody, but think in terms of policy packages and design them to suit, to reach different groups in the society to increase the effectiveness.
So, thank you. Magnus, I see you turned on your camera. Do you want to jump into the discussion?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Oksana just said, that this combination of packages of policies is exactly what we are looking at in this policy brief I mentioned before that we published with UNEP earlier this week. But we are looking at how combinations of tools addressing different factors that we know shaping lifestyle patterns can be combined. And I also strongly agree here that there are no silver bullets, and we also need to expand the toolbox. Of course, there are a number of policy tools that are currently being used, but as I said on the last slide in my presentation, I think we also need to think beyond the tools and kind of policy actions that are currently commonly used, and also start to look seriously at approaches that might seem to be a bit too drastic, but given the kind of emergency we are in, we need to have an honest conversation of things like, for example, rationing, harder choice editing, removing certain options from the market, etc. I don't see any other way forward.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Then there's, of course, the political will. How can that be found, given the difficulties? I don't know if anyone wants to have any final comment before I let in Göran to wrap up. Oksana, you're waving.
Just one small thing which hits me now, the importance of framing. How do we frame the issue? Is it suffering if we reduce consumption, or it's decluttering our packed lifestyles and having a breathing room and for time for family and for relaxation and so on. So I think this storytelling together with framing is really critical in how we introduce this sensitive issues to the population.
And Doris, last remarks.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, the justice aspect, right? Enough for me, but also enough for everybody else. And that also, as important as economic incentives are, they're also limited in that sense, right? And internalizing an environmental cost or raising the prices of foods will probably not stop space travel. And we heard before about whether that should take place at all. And it has an impact beyond the people who are doing it. And private planes have an impact beyond the people who are using private planes. So I think there are limits to what economic incentives will do, and will actually, I absolutely agree. We'll need to talk about limits, about bans, and so on, and enhance the political spectrum.
All right, thank you very much. We're at time. So Göran, I'll let you have the final last words.
Thank you very much. I will not try to summarize all these very important and interesting discussions, but still, I think it was interesting to see that in all of the 4 case study projects we looked at, it was apparent that there is a change in consumption, a decreased traveling, decreased air traveling, changed diets, reduced living spaces. There are some changes. Although the studies were different and the scenarios were different, there were some common things, and it's very difficult to imagine consumption in line with the climate targets that don't include at least some of these changes. I think it's very encouraging that both Sweden and Germany is going forward with consumption-based climate targets. I think it's necessary and needed. So very important to continue these discussions in different fora. For example, the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, where there is a webinar next week where the scientific report before the Stockholm Plus 50 conference will be presented, for example. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining, for presenting, for listening, for asking questions. Lots of interesting questions that we haven't had time to dig into now, but I'm sure you can follow them up directly with the presenters and panelists. Thank you all. Do you want to say a few final words, Robert?
No, I think that was a great summary. Thanks everyone in the audience for all the questions, and the panelists and the researchers. Very enlightening and exciting. And I think those will be posted on Mistra Sustainable Consumption's website, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Have a great weekend.